In this first video, let's assume that the four Gospels are, as many Christians believe, four independent accounts of Jesus' life and death, and that the authors were indeed the eyewitness followers of Jesus whose names these books bear. That being said, we don't get to count the supposed crowds of people the authors claimed as parallel eyewitnesses. That's part of the claim, not part of the evidence. The only accounts we can consider are the ones we actually have. That includes you, Paul. Your statement that 500 people saw Jesus alive again is part of your claim, not part of your evidence. I could just as easily invent witnesses for that one time I literally flipped a house, because Thor granted me superhuman strength for a brief moment. Don't believe me? Well, 500 people saw me do it. They're all dead now, but that doesn't matter. You see what I mean. But even so, we still have four eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, his miracles, his death, and his resurrection. Who could deny that? And Jesus even appeared to Paul years later, just to make sure. How can you deny this kind of testimony? Well, one major problem with eyewitness accounts is that they really are a dime a dozen. Many other claims, which most of us have no trouble rejecting offhand, also have large numbers of eyewitnesses who attest to their truth. In modern times, some of the most common eyewitness claims are about UFOs, as was the case for a group of people in Stephenville, Texas in 2008. In this instance, several dozen people claim to have seen a metallic object with bright lights on it flying low and fast over the land. Some even attested that they saw fighter jets chasing it. Wait, fighter jets? Really? Come on, how could someone misremember something so vivid? Surely they wouldn't remember fighter jets if there weren't any, right? Well, that's what they claim to have seen. So there must have been fighter jets, right? Are you convinced? Why not? We have dozens of recent eyewitnesses. Therefore, there must have been fighter jets flying around an alien ship. Now, I'm not convinced by this, even though we have all those recent eyewitnesses, and my guess is that you're not convinced either. Like I said, eyewitness testimony is cheap and easy to come by. Incidentally, the nearby naval base was able to confirm that they had no aircraft deployed in the area at that time. An even more bizarre UFO sighting happened in Australia in 1966, when it's reported that over 300 people saw a UFO flying around. One teacher famously described the event in detail, explaining that the object was round, silver, about the size of a car, and had a metal rod sticking up in the air. Furthermore, he claims that there were 5 airplanes flying around the object, in what was the most amazing flying I'd ever seen in my life. He described how the UFO evaded the airplanes for about 20 minutes, before it shot away and vanished into the distance in just a few seconds. Is this testimony convincing? Why not? He saw it. Over 300 people saw it. How could they be mistaken about something so extraordinary? But let's face it, UFO sightings are boring. We've all heard that kind of thing before. What about miracles? What about supernatural stuff? Well, that's easy. Look no further than Sathya Sai Baba. Sathya Sai Baba was a South Indian guru whose miracles drew crowds of thousands and which earned him somewhere between 6 million and 100 million followers. The claims attested to by eyewitnesses include ESP, being in 2 places at once, making ash pellets appear in his hand, healing the sick, and even raising the dead, not to mention having been born of a virgin. There are even people who, after his death in 2011, claimed that he isn't really gone, he's just hidden, and he'll be coming back very soon. You can even watch YouTube videos of his miracles, where you'll find commenters who claim to have visited him and seen his miracles firsthand. I have to admit, I was surprised to find these comments, but even so, I'm still not convinced that there was anything supernatural about this man, and I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that. Eyewitness testimony is cheap evidence, especially when it comes to extraordinary claims like these. In fact, since we're looking at India, Hinduism is full of miracle claims. One famous miracle from recent history was the milk miracle of 1995, where statues of the goddess Ganesha were reported to be drinking milk offered to them. Countless people claim to have seen it happen, and, as with Sathya Sai Baba, you can even find YouTube videos of it, with people in the comments section claiming to have witnessed it themselves. So, are you convinced by these eyewitness accounts? Why not? Surely if you believe the stories about Jesus on the basis of eyewitness testimony, then you'd also believe the stories about UFOs, Sathya Sai Baba, and Ganesha drinking milk. These events are all supported by eyewitness testimony. Recent eyewitness testimony. You could go ask these people about it right now, and they would tell you that they witnessed a real-life, honest-to-God miracle. If this is not enough to convince you that these events not only happened, but were supernatural or alien in nature, then why are the accounts in the Gospels enough to convince you that those events happened and that they were supernatural?
Consider, as though for the first time, the foundational claim of Christianity. The claim is this, that miracle stories of a sort that today surround a person like Sathya Sai Baba become especially compelling when you set them in the pre-scientific religious context of the first century Roman Empire, decades after their supposed occurrence. We have Sathya Sai Baba's miracle stories attested to by thousands upon thousands of living eyewitnesses, and they don't even merit an hour on the Discovery Channel. But you place a few miracle stories in some ancient books, and half the people on this earth think it a legitimate project to organize their lives around them. Does anyone else see a problem with that?
Like I said before, eyewitness testimony is cheap evidence, and accounts of extraordinary events are a dime a dozen. And it just so happens that, thanks to modern psychology, we now know a great deal about why this is the case, and we've studied the many ways in which people simply get it wrong. For one thing, it turns out that every time you recall a memory, your brain actually changes it. Different circumstances and past events where you thought about the original event have strong effects on how you view the original event. In short, memories are updated with new information that is produced during retrieval. As one researcher put it, your memory of an event can grow less precise, even to the point of being totally false, with each retrieval. Maybe a witness remembers something fairly accurately the first time because his memories aren't that distorted. After that, it keeps going downhill. In another study, where United States soldiers were being trained to handle interrogation as prisoners of war, under stressful, abusive conditions, researchers found that they could convince these soldiers that the person who had been interrogating them was, in fact, a different person who looked nothing like the actual interrogator. From the study, these findings demonstrate that memories for stressful events are highly vulnerable to modification by exposure to misinformation, even in individuals whose level of training and experience might be thought to render them relatively immune from such influences. As another data point, or rather a broad collection of data points, many people in my audience are probably old enough to remember the hysteria about massive and brutal abuse of children and adults that occurred around the late 80s and early 90s. It was very convincing to hear these stories described in great detail. The only problem was, they never happened, and many of them were simply impossible. At this point, I need to bring up one additional fact that we simply cannot ignore, and that is the chronology of the Gospels. This is because of the well-documented relationship between eyewitness testimony and the passage of time. As you can imagine, the less recent the event, the less accurate your memories are, and the more likely you are to accidentally change the memory as you recall it over and over. Once again, we're still assuming that the Gospels are indeed eyewitness accounts written by the people whose names they bear, which means we are also assuming that these eyewitnesses managed to live long enough to write their Gospels when they did. Granted, they would all be at or beyond the modern average for human lifespan, with John being around 100 years old when he wrote his Gospel, but again, let's just assume that they all managed to live that long. The earliest of Paul's letters were written about 23 years after the historical Jesus died, and in them, he recites a creed which said that Jesus came back to life after being killed. Paul himself was not witness to any of this, he had a vision of Jesus years later, so Paul doesn't exactly count as an eyewitness, but his letters still bear mentioning. The Gospel of Mark, our next account of Jesus' miracles, was written 40 years after Jesus' death, Matthew and Luke 50 years after, and John 70 years after. And these are relatively mid-range estimates. Some sources place these writings 10 or 20 years later than the dates I've listed. Think about that. The Gospel of Mark was written 40 years after Jesus' death. 40 years had passed before an eyewitness bothered to record the fact that he saw the creator of the universe come down to visit us and then literally die for us. Doesn't that seem just a bit strange? So, to return to my original point, Christians, if someone from another religion approached you and said that thousands of years ago, the central figure of their religion performed miracles and then transformed into a shimmering ghost after his death, waving goodbye to everyone as he drifted across the landscape, would you believe them? No? Alright, well, what if they told you that 4 ancient eyewitnesses saw this person's miracles firsthand, then they saw his ghost, and then they wrote about these events 20 to 70 years after the fact? Now would you believe in this person's religion? Would you trust these eyewitnesses to accurately report what happened? Would you trust these stories to have been accurately told in the intervening years? Would you trust these stories to have been accurately translated and copied? Would any significant doubt about your own faith creep into your mind upon hearing the evidence for this other religion? I highly doubt it. This evidence would only appeal to people who already subscribe to that religion, just like the evidence for the miracles of Jesus. Even if we grant the commonly held belief of the Gospels as 4 independent eyewitness accounts, this does very little to corroborate the extraordinary claims at the core of Christianity. As we've seen, there is more evidence for alien encounters and modern miracle gurus than there is for the divinity of Jesus, at least in terms of eyewitness testimony, which, as we've also seen, is not very good evidence in the first place. This is a large part of why I'm an atheist. Christians reject virtually all supernatural entities that have ever been proposed, and virtually all miracle claims that have ever been made, except for this one small group of such claims, and this one God among thousands. Christians will happily believe anything I've argued when it comes to other religions with other supernatural claims. Those people were mistaken, they lied, their memories were distorted, or they got caught up in mass hysteria. Pick your favorite explanation. But when it comes to Christianity, then all the supernatural claims are true, and it totally wasn't any of the things that explain away every other religion. And it just so happens that the one true religion, the one that is uniquely impervious to everything I've argued, just so happens to be the religion my parents taught me. Of course it is. Now, throughout this video, I've been granting the assumption that the authors of the Gospels were indeed eyewitnesses. However, as we'll see later in this series, this assumption is false.